Welcome back to Class Bravo. Before we get started with this episode, we want to take a few seconds to remember those who lost their lives on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Our prayers and condolences go to the families that have suffered during this tragedy. Class Bravo is a podcast for the aviation nerd in all of us. I'm Corey Clark.
And I'm Ray Gardner, and we're your hosts. If this is your first visit to Class Bravo, welcome, and we're glad you're here. Now let's take some time to look at what all has happened since our last recording.
You know, there's definitely been some huge incidents since our last recording, including the Ethiopian crash, Flight 302. And there's been a lot of conjecture out there from the media and from non-experts giving their opinion on what's going on. So I think before we really dive into, everything, why don't we talk about what the MCAS system actually is? I think, Ray, you know what MCAS means?
Yeah, MCAS stands for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. So it's basically angle of attack when it reaches what may be a stall. This kicks in and it pushes the nose of the aircraft down to bring it back into a more stable angle of attack.
Gotcha. And if I remember correctly, the previous versions of the 737 did not have this. And the reason why this airplane had it and why the 737 MAX is specifically the airplane model that's having issues is because the engines had to be moved. So they're actually tilted further forward under the wings, which could cause the plane to stall. So what Boeing did in order to combat this was they developed this MCAS software to counteract that. So I think, everybody that's in aviation knows that there's these little sensors on the airplane. Typically, it's at the front of the airplane on either side of the fuselage called an AOA sensor. So an AOA sensor it's an angle of attack, and that it tells the airplane and it tells the pilots inside where the airplane is it tilted up, down, the angle of attack. So the system takes readings from those sensors. Now, I said sensors with an S at the end, but there's only one version of the plane that uses both sensors, and that's when certain companies purchase an upgrade to where the system would read from either one. It looks like the two accidents that occurred with this system didn't include that feature.
Right, yeah. Looking at the preliminary report just released this week from Ethiopia, looks like that is what they're seeing early on in this investigation, is that one sensor was reading 15 degrees or so, and the other sensor was reading 74, 75 degrees, and therefore the system kicked on and pushed the nose down.
And that's clearly a issue with the software, and it's also an issue with how we look at safety. I firmly believe that if you have two sensors, if you have four sensors, if you have 20 sensors, they should all be cross-referencing each other and verifying the information. And if there's something wrong with one of those sensors and one of them is saying 75 and one is saying 15, then an automated system shouldn't be pushing an aircraft nose down. Right. I don't know what your opinion is on that, Ray, but that's mine.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I mean, that's a scary thought if one faulty sensor could lead to something like this. So I agree with you. Everything should cross-reference the other, especially if we want to make the system as efficient as possible.
I mean, and that's the safest way of doing something with a system like that. Boeing has come out and said that they're working on a software update. In fact, for right after the first incident, they came out and said that they were working on a software update. But it looks like that's going to take some time. Airplanes are grounded around the world, and if we look at, this is kind of going away from aviation a little bit right here, but if you look at public sentiment, people are worried about the Boeing 737 MAX, and you have Boeing has a problem on their hands. They need to show that their aircraft are safe again, and I believe that their aircraft are safe. I believe that our pilots in the United States are trained to handle situations like this, but This needs to be on every aircraft. It shouldn't be an option to cross-reference each other.
Absolutely. I think another piece of this too, that affects the public perception is the fact that I think it started in China. Some of the other countries across the globe grounded the fleet. And so it just kind of like a domino effect. One country decided we're gonna ground this fleet type, and then the next country, and then the next country, and they got to the U.S. and there was a temporary grounding, and then the official grounding of the fleet type. So that affects public perception as well, because the moment you say you can't fly this aircraft type, that just springs a load of different subjects and ideas into people's heads that aren't familiar with the subject matter.
Absolutely. We're also seeing some backlash against the FAA, which has been, interesting because typically you wouldn't see, the media start going after the regulatory agency, especially when this wasn't something that, the FAA technically would have known about before these incidents occurred. So it's, I don't know if you've seen anything on that.
Yeah, it looks like there's some questions into the certification process by the FAA, and then how manufacturers certify some of their own parts and new items. So that's the biggest thing and we see this from Elaine Chao, the Transportation Department secretary. She sent a letter basically she wants the inspector general to look into the certification process and basically do an audit of how some company like Boeing can basically create these types of sensors and systems, and it partially not be reviewed by the FAA. So I think that's the biggest thing, and now we're seeing that certification process. The FAA is looking to revamp their oversight summer of this year. So I think there's a lot of shakeup, especially in the U.S.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how the FAA changes, or if they change because of this incident. I think the FAA, I think Boeing, everybody is doing the right thing. They're all trying to make it so that this never occurs again. But when I look at the media and I see the people talking, I think the biggest disservice is not the FAA, it's not Boeing. It's the fact that the media has so-called experts on their channels where they're trying to talk about what the issue is. And if you watch these news broadcasts, they have people on there that they call experts, but these people haven't worked in aviation in 25 years. These people haven't, they don't have inside knowledge of what's going on. So instead of providing facts to the public and providing them with what has actually occurred with the airplane, they're providing an opinion, and that opinion is what's causing, panic with people. I think you and I, we've kind of, things have leaked out from the investigation. You can read it online with what's going on, but until that final report comes out, and I don't mean final report from Ethiopia. Unfortunately, I don't trust other countries' investigative bodies ever since what occurred down in South America, where a accident was caused by air traffic control and it was covered up. And they tried to say that it was the U.S. pilots that messed up and caused the accident. And the NTSB had to go in and figure out what actually occurred. I'm going to wait to see what the real reason is that this accident occurred when the NTSB releases their report.
I think that's the only way you can look at this type of accident, especially when people's lives were lost. We're losing the fact that people died, and I don't want to speculate as to how they died. I want to give true fact and reason. I agree with you wholeheartedly that we spend too much time getting caught up in opinions, especially these news outlets, and we're putting the fact to the back seat when that should be the first thing that we talk about.
Absolutely, and I don't want to diminish the other accident, which was actually people that I had seen in passing, etc., which is the Atlas air crash. We're still waiting to see what occurred with that incident.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that we can take from situations like this, especially in our current world and society where news travels so fast and it's at your fingertips 24/7, is that we have to discern between fact and opinion. And I think that, especially when it comes to this type of situation and this type of tragedy, we have to take our time and our own diligence to understand what's right and what is true in this situation. And there's a lot of jumping the gun, like you said, bringing in these experts that, the industry changes so much, even within a few years. The technology that comes out, especially now, things are changing every day. So, it's kind of hard to pull anything from something like that. So, yeah, that's the biggest takeaway for me in this situation is let the investigative bodies do their work, do their due diligence, and sort through everything that has happened and give us the boiled down facts of the investigation.
Exactly. And, just like you were saying, aviation is always changing. And, Uber changed one industry and they're changing other industries as well. And there's a company out there that's trying to change how people fly. And I believe you actually found this article about them, Blackbird.
Yes. So Blackbird is kind of like a charter, I would say a charter organization. Basically, what they're trying to do, and their founder and CEO, Rudd Davis, in this article basically talks about he wants to put everyday people in contact with certificated pilots in their aircraft, and that way you can fly from, let's say, Reno to Lake Tahoe, and you don't have to jump on a commercial airliner. You can charter with a pilot in his aircraft and be there in less time and pay less money. So kind of like the Uber of the skies, so to say.
A few years ago, there was another Uber of the skies. It was called Flight Now, and then there was Airpooler, and they had a similar thing. But the difference that I'm seeing is that it looks like Blackbird is requiring that all of their pilots be commercially trained pilots.
Exactly. That's the main thing, is that if you're going to charge someone to fly with you, you have to be a commercially certificated pilot. Private pilot can't ask someone to pay them to go fly. They can help you with the cost of fuel and renting the aircraft, but that gets into a whole nother mess of things. So I think that's the biggest legal situation that the other companies got into, and that's where Blackbird has built the foundation of their business practice.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how they go about this, because once you start going into charter operations, you have 135 regs, you have, it starts to get pretty weird, especially with maintenance requirements on aircraft. So it'll be interesting because it doesn't look like Blackbird actually owns these airplanes. It's actually the pilots who own these planes. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach that.
This is
hopefully
similar.
it'll work.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool idea, and I think it has the opportunity to be great. It reminds me similarly of Blade in New York City, where they contract helicopters to fly people to and from the helipads around the main island there in Manhattan. Yeah. So it's very similar in that regard, but it's not located in just one city. It's going to be throughout the U.S. And I think the biggest thing for them is understanding, the contract and how, like you said, the maintenance on these aircraft, because a lot of times they're going to these different plane clubs. Several people pitch in to buy one airplane and they share it amongst themselves and their friends. So I think that's the biggest issue that they're going to have to face is how do we get planes? How do we get pilots with the already ever-growing pilot shortage that we have in the U.S.? And then on top of that, what are the regs for maintaining these aircraft? Especially, you're working with the public. We want to make sure that everything is safe and working through the FAA and like you said, all of the regulations that that they have to get through.
And we're seeing other businesses that are being, quote unquote, hampered by regulations. And one of those businesses is Uber. Uber is coming out. They're trying to build this VTOL, aircraft that'll take off and get you places in 5 minutes. And, some of the concepts that they've designed are, without a pilot in the front or with the pilot in the front. Right now, that would be a commercial operation, and I could see that as being a 135 operator. Whereas this, it's a little bit different, So it'll definitely be interesting to see where it goes. Hopefully they're able to keep it strong, unlike Flight Now and Airpooler.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's a pretty neat interface. We'll have this article in our show notes and descriptions for the show, but you can go through and see kind of the operating system, the interface that you would have in the app. It shows you the aircraft, your estimated flight time, and then how much it costs per seat. So it's pretty cool. You can see it on the article, this Forbes article. You've got a Cirrus SR-22, and then they also show a Cessna 182. So it's a pretty neat idea. I think it's got a lot of value if it can stick around.
Absolutely, and I'm all for anything that makes flying easier, and this looks like it'll make flying easier. Now, there's also this other new thing out there, and it's this lighter wing concept that is going around. So I know you also found this one. So what were you thinking with this one?
Yeah, I always think it's interesting to see what new tech development is out there. And this came from MIT and MIT News, this article. And MIT and NASA engineers are trying to develop a new type of wing. And they're calling it a radically new kind of wing. Basically what it is it's assembled from hundreds of tiny identical pieces. It can change shape and control the plane's flight. So it's lighter. It's going to boost aircraft production, hopefully maintenance efficiency as well. It's neat. Instead of needing like ailerons and other types of pieces on the aircraft wing, it's a single wing with tiny little pieces. It's almost like, I hate to compare it to this, but the only thing I can think of that kind of makes sense is if you look at some of the new Nike shoes, the way that they have the cuts in the sole is that it can flex really well. And it's kind of like the idea behind this is that it can flex and do what it needs to without additional pieces on the wing, if that makes sense. So, it's supposed to be much more energy efficient and lighter. So at where we're at now, that's what everyone's looking for, right? They want the aircraft to be lighter and more efficient, use less gas, less fuel, and be able to be maintained for a longer period of time. So I always think it's neat to see what engineers are coming up with. Where it goes from here, don't know, but it's cool to see that this is the cutting edge that we're starting to see roll out in the industry now.
Absolutely. And if I remember correctly in reading it, they produced a wing that they, put in a what's it called, a wind tunnel, and tested it. And it's actually pretty impressive. This could really change how much fuel is required to fly an airplane. If I remember correctly, I read an article a few weeks ago that was talking about a flight from New York to Phoenix. You're looking at 18 gallons of jet fuel per person on that airplane, plus about 3,000 gallons in addition just for moving, the metal on the airplane. But for each person, it's about 18 gallons. So every pound that we can cut off that airplane is fuel savings. You make it more environmentally sound and better for us. You look at the results that they have, cubic, I don't want to get too technical, but a cubic meter of rubber is about 1,500 kilograms. A cubic meter of this new tech that they're putting out is 5.6 kilograms. And that is a huge weight saving. So, I definitely see this as being something that's looked at. I would love to see a full-scale model.
Right.
of an airplane, whether that's like a little Cessna or some kind of concept to see if it can actually work, and then take it larger.
Yeah, exactly. But going back to what you said about the weight of it, another thing that they say in the article is it has, this lattice that they're calling it, this material is the same stiffness as rubber, but it's almost 1,000th the density. Like, that's just amazing to me. Like, I know that's nerding out over it, but the fact that it can have the same stiffness, the same structure basically, and do the same job and weigh 1,000th less of the other material. It's amazing. And big thing they're talking about here is you can make any geometry, any shape that you want with this stuff. And you've got the traditional aircraft that's a tube with wings attached to it. So they're saying you could basically maneuver and change, do whatever you need to, and have the same tooling. That's a big issue in production, is you've got to build the tooling for the particular aircraft. And so that's why, you see certain aircraft last for decades, is because they don't want to change everything to build a new aircraft type, right? So I think that's huge in this, is that you can establish a longer time that you have an aircraft available. So it's a cool idea, and I wanted to share it with those that may not have heard about it or seen it yet.
Yeah, and I definitely encourage everybody to read that article. It's definitely pretty cool. NASA's working on it. So if you have time, check out the show notes, read it. This is definitely something that's not coming out next year. It'll probably be 10 years, if not 20 years, before we see this in, mass scale. But this is something to keep your eye on.
Absolutely.
There's also this other thing. I don't know how many people know about it, but there's a thing called a black box. I think the media has made it known every time there's an incident that we're looking for the black box. And there are some times where you can't find that black box because that black box may be, 10,000 feet underwater, or it doesn't survive the crash. So Honeywell is working with a satellite company to make it so that the black box transmits to a satellite, which then transmits it to the airline to store it. It's definitely a cool concept. The way they look at it is that it would be pulling a whole chunk of data every 5 minutes or every 15 minutes. It sounds like they haven't decided on that yet.
Right.
And then if there's a triggering event, then it would be pulling data every, constantly, basically. They say every 100 milliseconds, which to me is, pretty consistent.
Yeah.
But my thing is what is a defined trigger event? Is a defined trigger event the fact that they are at 1,000 feet higher than their flight planned altitude? There definitely needs to be some very defined triggers, because I can see this, these satellites, the data stream being taken up, because every day in the United States, airplanes are flying at different altitudes than what their flight plan says, or they're navigating around a storm and going around. So it'll definitely be interesting to see. I think what would be better is that, they're looking for certain things, and maybe this is on the aircraft side that triggers it to do a consistent upload, is, an engine issue. Sensors disagreeing with each other, for instance. That sounds pretty familiar.
I agree
things
with
like that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing here is looking at the parameters that FOQA departments are already using, the things that they are reporting on to their companies, right? So, whether a plane, has low speed at altitude, right? So I think that's where that discussion has to lead, right? And like you said, it happens. So, I mean, how do you define when this actually should be a trigger? But I think
exactly. And before we go further, we threw an acronym out there, and I don't think a lot of people know what it means. FOQA is Flight Operations Quality Assurance.
Right.
So that is.
Go ahead. So basically, FOQA is the capturing of the data that the aircraft sees in flight, and it gives safety departments in different airlines the ability to review the data, what's occurring in flight with their aircraft. And then that way, that data can be reviewed and given a chance to maybe define better procedures. Are we seeing an issue somewhere that we need to resolve, et cetera? So sorry, I should have explained a little more there, but that's kind of where I'm leaning, is there are set parameters for that data that's being pulled. So maybe they start there, and that be where we start to see where the triggers are defined.
Absolutely. FOQA departments all over have created hundreds of different kinds of events that they can pull and run queries on. So maybe that's where, that's what triggers a consistent upload. Another benefit to this that I see is that you can have live monitoring. Granted, if it's a block every 15 minutes, it's not, it's 15 minutes delayed, but you could have this going into the cloud and going into servers that are then running an analysis and saying, okay, the airplane is doing this, the engine is at this, maybe we need to check this out. So it could also provide the airline with the ability to be more proactive on maintenance instead of reactive with maintenance.
Absolutely. I think that's where the industry is going anyway, is looking at wireless data recorders and that sort to get the information faster. So, I mean, this is the next step, is using in-flight connectivity, which, that opens a whole nother door of things, is, making sure that works and that there's not a failure there. But I think this is the next step in that evolution.
Absolutely. I think technology is really moving at a fast pace, and in aviation, when technology moves at a fast pace, you really need to have a counterbalance. So, whether it's a new wing, new way of transmitting data, or, the way that people board an airplane, it takes time. So don't expect to see all these things overnight, guys. It's going to take, probably a few months for some of these smaller things to be worked out. I could definitely see this new black box tech coming out in the next year or so, because it's already being tested from what the article says. Ray, I really appreciate the time you took to speak with me, and hopefully, I know we've been talking a lot, and I'm hoping that on the next few episodes we can get some people to talk to us that are experts in their field and see what's going on in their world, whether it's training or engineering. And just to one more little tech part is that virtual reality is something that is being used in aviation, and I don't know if a lot of people know that. So maybe we can try and get somebody that has some knowledge of that VR tech on the podcast.
I would love that. I think that's the next generation of training, and I think that's an awesome avenue to go down. I agree. There's a lot of people out there, the connections we have, and hopefully we can get them on the show and bring you some insight from someone other than us too. But looking forward to it. Always love spending the time talking with you, Cory, and having a chance to share what we're finding and what we're seeing, and ultimately what we both love, which is the aviation industry, with all of you. So we really appreciate y'all taking the time to listen to us.
Everything that we said on this is just our opinion. This doesn't reflect on our employers or on past employers. So if you're listening to this and you work with us, just remember, this is our own opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, and we would hope that you would subscribe to our channel, our iTunes, Apple Podcast. We're also on Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Play. And then follow us on social media. We're on Instagram at Class Bravo Podcast, Facebook at Class Bravo 1, Twitter at Class_Bravo_. Anything else you want to say, Cory?
Yeah, I mean, we're working on our website. We're hoping to get all of our stuff on there. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on the next podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. Blue skies.